So in this video, we're going to talk about the Homeric Hymn to Dionysus by Roz Kaveney, which I'm reading out of Women Recreating Classics, edited by Emily Hauser and Helena Taylor. This is a rough poem, in the sense that the primary theme is sexual violence, which is actually quite fitting in a strange and uncomfortable way when we're thinking about women recreating classics, which is the premise of the collection, right? Because in ancient Greco-Roman literature, women are, as often as not, perhaps, subject to sexual violence, physical violence, certainly emotional abuse and neglect, etc., etc. And it is quite odd, right? Because even in a lot of the stories where sexual violence is not sort of directly addressed, things like Agamemnon by Aeschylus, or Hippolytus by Euripides. Yeah, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, right? So these are like plays in which sexual violence is not directly incorporated or discussed, but the characters' backstories, the female characters' backstories, is basically that like they were carried off as war trophies, essentially. Clytemnestra, in different versions, different iterations of the myth, she was married to someone else, had a kid with someone else, and Agamemnon comes along, kills her husband, and takes her as his wife, in much the same way that he takes Cassandra as his wife, although there's no indication of, within the Aeschylus, there's no indication of whether or not Cassandra has been sexually violated or he was waiting till they got home, whatever it is. Anyway, it's bad business, right? And the same kind of thing with Phaedra, right? She seems, in some versions of the myth at least, to essentially have been kidnapped by Theseus, right? So this is pervasive in ancient Greek and Roman literature. Ovid's Metamorphosis often focuses on these actual or attempted experiences of sexual violence. And what is striking and interesting about the Homeric Hymn to Dionysus is that it's not about sexual violence against a woman. It's about sexual violence against Dionysus, one of the gods. The god of wine, the god of theater, the god of madness and revelry, right? And this is actually quite fitting as well, right? Because it's one of the things that makes Dionysus such an interesting deity among the pantheon of ancient deities is that he seems to be almost the only god who is regularly called upon to prove his divinity. So for me, as a Greek drama person, the most obvious example of this is Euripides' Bacchae, in which Dionysus shows up in town and Pentheus is like, "You're not a god, you're an imposter." And Dionysus takes exception to this and just fucking wrecks Pentheus completely, right? But also in, like, Ovid, we have the story of the Menaides, who are living in this town, Orchomenos, I think, and Dionysus shows up and he's like, "I am going to prove that I'm a god. And to prove this, I command all of the women of Orchomenos to go out to the hills, get drunk, get naked, dance around worshiping me. And the three daughters of King Menelaus are like, no. And so Dionysus turns them into bats. Right? So Dionysus is like weirdly always having to prove his divinity in a way that people like Zeus and Aphrodite and Athena and Hephaestus are not, right? These other, particularly the Olympian gods, the pantheon of the Olympians, are never, other than Dionysus, as far as I know, called upon to be like, yes, here's my birth certificate that establishes I'm a god. Here's my godding license. You can check that, make sure it's still valid, etc., right? But this is the setup of Kaveney's poem. So we start. Sits on the stones where desert meets the sea, no purpose seeing what the day would bring, buff shining oil curled hair, a single ring on finger, purple robed, elbow on knee, in godlike thought. This is the description of Dionysus, right? And of course it's an interesting one because the question of what Kaveney chooses to, or Kaveney, I did look this up because I wasn't sure, and now I've forgotten it. I think it's Kaveney. I'm going to keep saying it that way. I hope that's correct in the way that I started out saying it, because I definitely said it right the first time. Anyway, so that's the way that Kaveney describes Dionysus, and the details are interesting, right? Buff, shining, oil-curled hair, a single ring on finger, purple robed. Now, the purple is, of course, an important detail because purple in the ancient world, as many, many people know, was associated with royalty, right? Purples and blues were expensive dyes. They were hard to make. The dye-making process, especially for purple, but for blue as well, was extraordinarily unpleasant. And so it was very hard to get cloth in purple or blue. And so this is an immediate symbol of the status of this person, right? Clothing in the ancient world told us a lot about a person's social position in a way that it does not today. But we've also got that shining oil curled hair and single ring. Now, in the ancient world, that may not have been a super indicative set of descriptors, but in the modern world, in the modern Western world, Kaveney's British, I'm reading this as an American, shining oil curled hair evokes femininity, right? Anything like in the ancient world, long hair was often thought of as quite masculine, right? Men, especially young men, would often wear their hair quite long. And of course, that does happen today. We do have long-haired men around, but particularly we think, but that's often sort of associated still to today with feminine men, right? David Bowie, interestingly enough, I think in the mid 60s, late 60s, actually started a group that was called something like the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men, right? Because they would be sort of mocked, they would be accused of being girls or whatever it is, right? And of course, as we know, within a patriarchal society, the worst thing that one can be accused of is being feminine, right? So that sort of the idea that this character whom is never actually named as Dionysus, but we sort of know because we're smart and we can read the title. The fact that this character pays attention to their hair, that they have very nice hair, is significant, right? The ring, wearing jewelry, and I wear rings. Like this is not really is not really a gendered thing, and historically it would not have been a gendered thing either. But today we tend to think of jewelry as more feminine, and men don't really wear as much jewelry in the modern Western world. So we've got these indications that we have a feminine male character, right? And then this happens. They see him, wade to shore no good intentions, men who are wolf to men, prey on the helpless, doom never again. But then we get a turn within this stanza, right? One senses something, kneels. Friends, I implore, let this one go. See how unearthly fair gods are this handsome. Ask him for his name, then worship him. I will accept no blame for what comes otherwise, nor take my share, money or curse. So there is a recognition among these pirates, I guess, these sort of ocean-based marauders. There's a recognition from one guy that something here is not as it seems. This is not a person that we should capture, we should assault, whatever it is. Now, what's interesting about that is, on the one hand, yeah, cool, good. But at the same time, don't capture and assault anybody. Just don't do it. The idea, like the problem with this, that to the extent that this character is a good character, he's only a good character to the extent that he says, let's not do anything to Dionysus. But of course, the implication would be, if this weren't a god, go to town, right? This becomes the problem. And this is actually part of the problem with the, like, a lot of the sort of discourse around not all men, right, it's sort of premised on the idea that, like, the exception allows for the sustaining of general systemic violence, right? The fact that some men do not commit sexual violence is used as a prop to sustain a patriarchal system that fundamentally incorporates and excuses and allows for widespread violence against women and gender nonconforming people as well. It's worth mentioning, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. It's worth mentioning. So this is the sort of problem with the idea that this sailor or pirate or whatever it is somehow a good guy, right? He's not. His self-preservation instinct kicks in because he senses that something is not right, and if they do what they otherwise would do, then the consequences will be dire. But it's not an ethical stance against kidnapping, sexual violence, murder, whatever it is, right? So we have this problem here. But then we go on. His boss shoves him aside. A boy this pretty, his own weight in gold. We all take turns. The mattress in the hold, stained with our sweat and cum, his legs spread wide. They club him, bin his wrists with plastic ties, and twist his balls, stick fingers up his arse, throw him aboard. The sea grows still as glass, no clouds but thunder rolls about the skies. So we have the kidnapping, right? And this is where we get into the sort of sexual violence depicted somewhat graphically within the poem. I'm not going to say any more about that because, yeah, it is what it is. But then we move to the revenge of Dionysus. And again, this is very typical of these Dionysian stories. The bit from Ovid, the bit from Euripides, right? Where when Dionysus is in some way put upon, in those stories, it's really just people being like, yeah, I'm not convinced you're a god, so I'm not going to worship you. Here, it's obviously much more violent, much more intrusive. Things go badly. Dionysus wields his power often without mercy, which is an interesting conception, and you'll see why when we get to the end of the play. So here's what it says. So we got the sea grows still as glass, no clouds but thunder rolls about the skies. This is the ominous warning signs that things are about to go sideways. The bilges fill with wine. Wine, of course, Dionysus being the god of wine and intoxication. The deck stains red. Vines cluster around the mast, heavy with grape vines and grapes being symbols of Dionysus. Captain receives the punishment for rape. Boy becomes lion and bites off his head. I don't know. To be honest, I don't know that the lion is associated with Dionysus particularly, but Dionysus, like the other gods, does periodically transform into animals, right? In the Bacchae, he becomes or is perceived to become a bull in order to escape Pentheus's jail. So there is that transformative power. Crew mad with fear leap sudden overboard, mid-air twist into dolphins. Again, transformation as punishment is a common thing, particularly in Ovid. Swim away. Unchanged, the one survivor starts to pray, whichever god you are, I call you Lord. Boy smiles. Oh, he does identify as Dionysus. I said that he didn't earlier, but I was wrong. I forgot this stanza, which is on the next page. Boy smiles, I'm Dionysus, Zeus's son by gold-wooed Semele, who died in flame seeing her lover's glory. Preach my name and drink my wine. I could be anyone, so honor any strangers that you find. They might be gods, and some gods are less kind. So there's a little bit of a sort of what if God was one of us vibe at the very end here, and I don't hate it. It's a good moral lesson, right? The idea that you should treat strangers, you should treat those that you don't know with dignity, respect, you should be compassionate and kind, etc., etc. I very much agree. Those are excellent things. One problem I have with it is that it does risk, and this is a larger problem. This is not a problem specifically with Kaveney's poem, but this whole line of reasoning, like, what if God was one of us? Be kind to people. Any stranger that you meet could be a deity. The sort of Judeo-Christian, I think this is in Jewish theology as well to a certain extent, but I'm not 100% sure. Different denominations are going to vary on this. But like the idea that each of us has the spark of the divine in us, I think that's part of Jewish theology, and I can't remember the Hebrew term for it just off the top of my head, but right, the sort of idea that everybody has an element of the divine, and therefore we're all made in God's image and all this stuff, right? The problem that I have with this is a basis for ethical action and for treating other people kindly, which again, 100% in favor of. Do those things. The problem is that it risks devaluing that person as such. They are worthy of ethical consideration and compassion to the extent that they may be divine or have divine qualities, as opposed to just they are worthy of ethical consideration in and of themselves, right? That they are because they are a person, because they matter in themselves, you should not do terrible things to that person, right? So I think that's a sort of problematic element with this ideology. And again, I'm not taking issue specifically with Kaveney's version of this. I think it's a good moral lesson, and I don't critique it. So the other thing that I think that I want to talk about with this, because I think this is really important. Dionysus is also a unique figure among the major Greco-Roman gods, Dionysus or Bacchus in Rome, because Dionysus is, I would say, more gender fluid than the other Greco-Roman gods. And again, something like the Bacchae is a really excellent example of this, right? Because Pentheus, under the trance of Dionysus, is compelled to dress as a woman and go out into the forest, where the women who have taken on this traditionally masculine role as hunters and killers of lions in particular, in their maddened frenzy, misidentify Pentheus as a lion, and they attack him and kill him with their bare hands, right? So there's a gender swapping, right? Where Pentheus, the male ruler of this city, is dressed as a woman and sent out to face violence by the opposite gender. Whereas the women who start the play who prior to Dionysus's arrival, right? At the start of the play, they're sort of already off in the woods doing Maenad madness and festivizing, right? But before Dionysus's arrival, they would have been very sort of domestic. They would have been very demure, submissive, etc. And it's worth being explicit, they would have regularly probably been subject, many of them, to sexual violence, even if only by their husbands, right? But so they are transfigured into this very masculine role of hunters, and they go after Pentheus. So there is a sort of reversal of these gender roles, and also the roles from which violence is typically wielded within a patriarchal society. But Dionysus is also a kind of gender fluid character. Pentheus mistakes Dionysus, or pretends to mistake, it's not 100% clear, Dionysus for a girl, right? Pentheus mocks Dionysus for looking very feminine, etc., etc. And of course, in Kaveney's poem, a boy this pretty, right? Pretty is an adjective that we tend to associate with women rather than with men, right? The male equivalent would be something like handsome, right? And this sort of idea, the idea of identifying this character as a target for sexual violence, which again is most commonly visited on women within patriarchal societies, feminizes Dionysus from the perspective of these pirates. Now, part of the reason that that is important is that Kaveney is a trans activist, right? So part of her work, alongside being a writer, being all of these other things, an artist, etc., is that she is an activist who campaigns for the rights of trans people. And so a figure like Dionysus has an inherent appeal for the trans community, because Dionysus sort of along with a figure like Tiresias, who would be another one, sort of embodies this ethos of changeability, the changeability or the fluidity of gender, and the idea that, because Dionysus does not necessarily object to being sort of identified as feminine, at least in my reading of the texts that I have encountered about him, he doesn't necessarily reject that idea. And indeed, his followers tend to be female. So Dionysus has a strong identification with the feminine in a way that most other Greco-Roman male deities don't seem to. So that sort of, he becomes I think this very sort of positive figure out of which positive depictions of trans identities, trans existence, trans power can be built.